There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a farm in the last week of September in Iowa. A silence that has weight to it, that presses down on the fields and the fences and the gravel roads like something alive and deliberate. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of completion, of a season that has said what it needed to say and is now waiting for the next one to begin. Walter Cobb had lived inside that silence for 61 years. And he understood it the way he understood the hydraulic pressure on his tractor or the smell of rain coming up from the southwest. He understood it not because he had studied it, but because he had paid attention to it every single day for as long as he could remember. And paying attention was the one discipline he had never once allowed himself to abandon. He was standing in this gravel driveway beside his machine shed on the morning of September 11th, 1979, holding a piece of paper that the county courthouse had prepared for him the previous Thursday and that he had been carrying in the breast pocket of his canvas jacket ever since, without quite being ready to do what he had decided to do with it. The corn was in, the soybeans were in, the ground was resting, and Walter Cobb was waiting for a boy to walk up from the road. The paper was the title to a 1962 John Deere 4010 tractor. He had bought that machine new from the dealer in Iowa Falls in the spring of 1962. He had paid $4,200 for it, which in 1962 was a number serious enough that Mabel had gone quiet for 3 days after he wrote the check. Not because she thought he was wrong, but because she felt the weight of it the same way he did. And feeling the weight of something together was their version of conversation about the things that mattered most. The tractor had been his primary machine for the first 12 years. And then it had become what farmers in that part of Iowa called a utility tractor, which meant it did the work that did not require raw power, but required reliability and availability and the particular kind of trust that only comes from knowing a machine across 17 years of use in every condition the Iowa climate could produce. He knew that machine the way he knew his own hands. Garrett Weston had come out to the farm in August, 6 weeks earlier, driving the newer model pickup that the dealership kept for sales calls, and had looked at the 4010 for approximately 4 minutes before offering Walter $3,200 for it. It was a fair offer. Walter had considered it for about the same amount of time that Garrett had considered the tractor, and then he had said he would think about it, which both men understood to mean no. Garrett had not hidden his opinion about this. He was a practical man, and practical men in the implement business did not see the logic of keeping a 17-year-old tractor in a shed when $3,200 could be doing something useful. He had said as much to 2 or 3 people at Dot Mercer's diner the following week, not cruelly, but in the way of a man who finds a neighbor's decision genuinely puzzling and cannot quite keep the puzzlement to himself. Walter had heard about it from Dot herself, who had told him the way she told everyone everything, which was directly and without elaboration, because Dot Mercer had been running her diner for 19 years and had long since concluded that the facts of a situation were usually more interesting than anyone's opinion of them. Walter had not responded in any visible way. He had finished his eggs and left his usual tip and driven back to the farm and gone into the machine shed and stood next to the 4010 for a while. And then he had driven into Iowa Falls and stopped at the courthouse and asked about the process for transferring a vehicle title, because in Iowa a tractor was titled like a vehicle, and the woman at the desk had told him what he needed, and he had come back the following Thursday and picked up the paper. Now he was standing in the driveway holding it. The boy was walking up from the road. His name was Eli Boone, and he was 17 years old, and Walter had been watching him for 8 weeks with the same quiet attention he gave to everything that required judgment. He had first noticed him in July, washing dishes at Dot's through the pass-through window, visible from the table where Walter ate his breakfast every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Not because the boy did anything remarkable, because of the quality of his aloneness. There is a particular kind of aloneness that belongs to young people who have spent their whole lives without a stable place in the world, and it is different from loneliness, which is about wanting something you do not have. This aloneness is about having learned not to want things too specifically, because wanting things specifically is a kind of hope, and hope has a cost that some people learn very early they cannot afford. Walter had seen that quality before. In men he had known during the hard years of the 1940s, men who had come back from places that had reorganized their understanding of what could be relied upon. He recognized it in Eli Boone through a pass-through window in July of 1979, and he had filed it away without comment. He had asked Dot about the boy 2 weeks later, on a Thursday morning when the diner was quiet. Dot told him what she knew, 17 years old, out of the foster system in Des Moines, had aged out of it in June and gotten on a Greyhound bus with $11 and ridden it as far as the $11 would carry him, which was Eldora, Iowa, county seat of Hardin County, population approximately 3,000, had walked into the diner and asked if she needed a dishwasher. She had looked at him for 4 seconds and said yes. Walter sat with his coffee for a while after that and then went back to his eggs. In August, he came into the diner on a Saturday morning and asked Dot if the boy could be spared for a few hours. Dot said she supposed so. Walter came back that afternoon and told Eli to get in the truck. He did not explain where they were going or why, and Eli did not ask. And Walter noted this as the first significant piece of information about the boy's character. They drove out to the farm. Walter showed him the shop, the 401 the 4430 that had become his primary machine since 1974. The layout of the implements and the storage and the way the shed was organized, which was according to a logic that was entirely consistent and entirely his own. He showed Eli how to grease the fittings on the 4010, how to check the hydraulic fluid level, how to adjust the fan belt tension. Eli was quiet and attentive. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not perform engagement the way some young people did when they were trying to make an impression. He simply watched and listened, and when Walter asked him to try something himself, he tried it with his hands before his head, which was the right order of operations for a man learning machinery. Walter brought him back to town at noon. He came back the following Saturday and did the same thing. By the last week of September, Eli had spent every Saturday at the farm and several evenings during the week, and Walter had taught him to operate the 4010, beginning with the hydraulic system and ending with the specific feel of the clutch engagement at different throttle settings. What Walter had not expected, and what had altered his thinking in the weeks since, was the boy's mechanical intuition. It was not the intuition of someone who had read about machines. It was the intuition of someone whose relationship to physical systems was native rather than learned. The ability to feel a problem before the gauges confirmed it. To hear a bearing begin to fail 2 weeks before replacement became urgent. Walter had not said anything about this to Eli. He had not said anything about it to anyone. He had simply noted it and allowed it to settle into his thinking alongside everything else he had observed. On the morning of September 11, 1979, he handed the title to the 1962 John Deere 4010 to a 17-year-old boy who had $11 in his pocket and a duffel bag with 4 shirts in it. And he did it in the gravel driveway beside the machine shed because that was the place where the transaction would make the most sense, where the machine itself was visible and present and part of the conversation. Eli took the paper and read it and looked up at Walter. He said, "Why?" Walter said, "Because you are going to need it." Eli said he could not pay for it, and Walter said he knew that. Eli said he did not understand, and Walter said he would. Then Walter went inside to make coffee because the conversation was finished and there was nothing useful to be added to it. Eli stood in the driveway holding the title for several minutes. Then he went into the machine shed and checked the oil on the 401. Oh, because that was the kind of thing you did when someone handed you something you did not have words for. Garrett Weston heard about it by Friday. He was at Dot's diner on Friday morning with 2 other men from the implement business in the county, and when the information reached him, he laughed in the way of someone who has just received confirmation of a suspicion he has been carrying for some time. He said that Walter Cobb had finally gone the way of men who farm alone too long. He said that giving a $3,000 tractor to a dishwasher from nowhere was the kind of thing that happened when a man stopped having anyone to talk sense to him. The 2 other men smiled in the way of people who want to be agreeable without committing to a position. Dot Mercer, who was refilling coffee at the next table, said nothing. She had known Walter Cobb for 19 years, and she had her own opinion about what he had done. But she kept it to herself, because the opinion was not the kind that translated well into a diner conversation, being less about whether the decision was practical and more about whether Garrett Weston understood the difference between value and price. Eli spent the winter of 1979 saving money with a discipline that Dot found remarkable. He was renting a room above the hardware store on Main Street for $60 a month and working every shift Dot could give him and putting aside everything he did not need to survive. He was not doing this because he had a plan in any formal sense. He was doing it because the tractor was in Walter's machine shed waiting for spring, and the spring was going to require something from him, and he intended to be ready for it. He asked Walter if the 4010 could stay in the shed through the winter. Walter said yes. He asked Walter, on a Saturday morning in November, what 40 acres of ground in Hardin County would rent for from a retired farmer who was not using it. Walter thought about this for a moment and said between $12 and $15 per acre per year, depending on the ground and the arrangement. Eli said he knew a man named Clarence Hayward who had ground east of Eldora that had been sitting idle for 2 seasons. Walter said that Clarence was honest and that the ground was good. He did not say anything else. Eli went to see Clarence Hayward in December. He explained what he intended to do and what he had to do it with, which was 1 tractor, a small amount of saved money, and no experience beyond what he had learned in Walter's shed since August. Clarence listened to all of this and then asked one question, which was whether Walter Cobb had given him the tractor or sold it to him. Eli said given. Clarence sat with that for a moment and then said he could have 40 acres at $12 per acre on a handshake, and they could figure out the rest as they went. Eli planted that 40 acres in the spring of 1980. Using the 4010 and a 2-row planter he had bought at a farm auction in March for $220, which was every dollar he had saved beyond his rent and his operating costs. He didn't know, going into that first season, whether the numbers would work. He knew that he was doing the work correctly, which was the thing Walter had shown him, without using those words. Every Saturday for 6 months, that the work done correctly was its own argument, and that everything else followed from that, or it did not, and if it did not, then the problem was not the work. The work done correctly was not the same as the work done easily. The spring of 1980 was cold and the planting window was narrow, and there were mechanical problems with the planter that Eli solved with parts he could not entirely afford, and time he spent in the shed at night by the light of a single bulb hanging from a wire. He asked Walter about the problems when he could not solve them himself. Walter answered in the way he answered everything, which was with precision and without elaboration, giving Eli exactly what he needed to work the problem himself and nothing beyond that. The first season produced enough to cover his rent and his seed and his fuel, and a payment toward the planter note and not much more. Eli did not consider this a failure. He considered it the first year of something, which was a different calculation entirely. In March of 1981, he drove to the Hardin County State Bank on the main street of Eldora and asked to see someone about a small operating loan. He needed $1,400 to bid on a 1968 John Deere 55 combine that was coming up at an estate sale in Franklin County. Without a combine, he would need to hire custom cutting for his harvest, which cost more per bushel than owning the machine, even an old one, and which put him at the mercy of someone else's schedule during the 10-day window when the corn was ready and the weather was cooperating and every other farmer in the county needed the same thing at the same time. The man behind the desk was named Rick Danner. He was 30 years old and he had a degree from the University of Iowa, and he had been at the bank for 4 years, and he wore the kind of dress shirt that required ironing, and he had the careful manner of someone who had learned to project confidence without having enough experience yet to know the difference between confidence and certainty. He asked Eli a series of questions about his income and his assets and his credit history, which was essentially no history, and his collateral, which was a 3-year-old renter's arrangement on 40 acres he did not own, and a 1962 tractor that the most recent dealer valuation had placed at around $800. Through the window behind Rick Danner's desk, Eli could see the 4010 parked in the lot across the street where he had left it because the bank's parking lot was too small for a tractor and a truck together. Rick Danner looked at the tractor through the window for a moment and then looked back at Eli and said that the asset situation was a challenge. He said that the bank's lending criteria required collateral that was proportionate to the loan amount, and that a tractor from the Kennedy administration was not going to meet that threshold regardless of its mechanical condition. He said this in a voice that was not unkind, but that had the quality of someone who had already decided the outcome of the conversation before it began and was now performing the formality of explaining the decision. He said the words in a way that carried. There were 2 other people waiting in chairs by the door, a woman with a folder on her lap and a man in a feed store hat, and they heard it because the bank was not large and Rick Danner's voice was clear. And Eli understood that this was one of those moments that accumulates in a person's account of what the world thinks of them and what they intend to do about it. He didn't say anything. He stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked out of the bank into the March cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at the 4010 across the street. Then he drove back to the farm and spent the rest of the afternoon patching a hydraulic line that had been seeping at the fitting since November. Walter was at his kitchen table when Eli came to the house at dusk. Walter poured him coffee and did not ask what had happened at the bank, because he had known before Eli left that morning what was likely to happen, and he had not offered an opinion then, and he did not offer one now. They sat with the coffee for a while, and then Eli said he was going to have to find another way to get the combine, and Walter said he supposed so. And that was the end of the conversation. 3 days later, Floyd Briggs, who farmed 280 acres 6 miles east on the county road, stopped by Walter's place looking for help. His 1971 John Deere 402 had a hydraulic failure that had shut him down in the middle of spring fieldwork, and the dealer in Iowa Falls had told him the earliest they could get a technician out was 11 days from now. Floyd could not wait 11 days. Walter told him Eli could look at it. Eli looked at it that afternoon. The failure was at the hydraulic pump. A seal gone and a valve body with a crack that had been propagating for some time without being caught. He drove to Iowa Falls the same evening and sourced the parts for $34 from the dealer's parts counter, paying cash. He spent the following day replacing the seal and the valve body and pressure testing the system. And by evening, the 4020 was running with the kind of authority it had been designed to run with. Floyd Briggs paid him $280 and said he would tell anyone who asked. Eli drove to the estate sale in Franklin County in April with $1,400 in cash and came home with a 1968 John Deere 55 combine that needed work and that he had evaluated in 30 minutes at the sale by walking around it and listening to it and putting his hands on the things that would tell him what the visual inspection could not. He paid $1,100 for it and kept the $300 for parts. He did not go back to the Hardin County State Bank. Rick Danner was let go the following February when the bank's agricultural lending division was reorganized following the first wave of the farm crisis that would reshape the economics of the rural Midwest for the rest of the decade. Dot set it in front of Eli the way she set down a plate. One clean motion, nothing added. Eli heard it the way a man hears news that is already settled into fact before the words arrive. He finished his coffee and left his tip and drove back to the farm. He did not think about Rick Danner again. The 1980s farm crisis came to Hardin County the way it came to most of the Midwest, which was steadily and without much warning for the people who had borrowed heavily against land values that had been inflating through the late 1970s on the assumption that they would keep inflating. Eli Boone had not borrowed heavily. He had borrowed carefully and repaid ahead of schedule, and he had never borrowed against land he did not own or at valuations he did not believe were real. This had not been a strategy in any formal sense. It had been the result of operating on the narrowest margins that allowed the work to continue, which meant that the borrowing had always been minimal by necessity rather than by principle, though over time the two had become the same thing. He lost some rented ground when the landlords who were carrying debt sold out to larger operations that could offer higher cash rents. He lost a custom cutting arrangement he had been counting on for 2 seasons. He watched 3 of the farmers he knew from the co-op and from the auction rings lose their operations entirely. Men who had farmed well but had been caught by the math of borrowed money at the wrong moment in the cycle. And he watched this without judgment, because he understood that the difference between their situation and his was partly discipline and partly timing, and partly the fact that a 61-year-old farmer in September of 1979 had handed him a piece of paper that had made it possible for him to begin without debt. He did not say this to anyone. He understood it in the way he understood most important things, which was privately and without the need to explain it. By 1985, Eli Boone was 23 years old. He was farming 160 acres, renting from 3 different landlords, using the 4010 and the combine and a collection of implements he had accumulated one at a time from auctions and estate sales and the occasional distressed sale of equipment from operations that had not survived the crisis. He had 2 employees during planting and harvest, men he paid fairly and worked alongside rather than above. He had put a down payment on a small house on the eastern edge of Eldora, a house that needed work and that he was giving work to on the evenings when the fields did not need something. He was not wealthy. He was not comfortable in any conventional sense, but he was established, which in Hardin County meant something specific and durable, something that could not be undone by one bad season or one banking decision or the laughter of an implement dealer on a Friday morning. Something that had its foundation not in the market or the weather or anyone else's opinion of what was possible, but in 6 years of work done correctly, one field at a time, with a machine that was 23 years old and that he maintained with the same faithfulness that Walter Cobb had maintained it before him. Garrett Weston was still running the John Deere dealership in Iowa Falls. He had never mentioned, in any conversation that Eli was aware of. The Friday morning at Dot's Diner when he had called Walter Cobb a man who had gone the way of men who farm alone too long. He had, perhaps, concluded that the story did not reflect well on his judgment and had simply allowed it to settle into the part of memory that holds the things we prefer not to examine. Walter Cobb, in the fall of 1985, was 67 years old. He had scaled back to the ground he could manage alone and had rented the rest to a neighbor on terms that were fair to both parties. On a Thursday morning in October of that year, he drove out to Eli's operation and walked the edges of 3 fields without saying much. Looking at the soil condition and the residue management and the way the drainage had been handled on the east end of the second field where the ground had a tendency to pond in wet springs. He walked back to the truck in the late afternoon light and stood there for a moment looking at the 4010 which was sitting at the edge of the machine shed where Eli parked it after the season's last use. He said, "You're farming it right." Eli said he had had a good teacher. Walter got in his truck and drove back to his own farm. That was the only time, in all the years of their friendship, that either of them came close to saying directly what the tractor had meant. Close was enough. In Hardin County, Iowa, among men who understood that the most important things did not require saying, close was sometimes more than enough. The years between 1985 and 2001 built a life the way a river builds a floodplain, not through any single dramatic event, but through the steady pressure of water moving in a consistent direction over a long enough period of time. Eli Boone farmed through those years the way Walter Cobb had farmed through his, which was without complaint and without spectacle, and with the understanding that the ground asked the same things of you every season regardless of what else was happening in your life, and that answering those demands correctly was both the work and the reward. He married Clara Donnelly in the spring of 1987. She was a practical woman from a farm family in neighboring Franklin County, and she understood without needing to be told what it meant to be married to a man whose primary relationship was with the land he worked. She did not compete with it. She built alongside it, the way a good windbreak is planted, not to stop the wind but to work with it, to redirect its energy into something that serves the whole operation. They had 3 sons. Owen came in 1988. Nathan in 1991, Dean in 1994, and each of them grew up on the farm the way farm children do, which is to say they were on equipment before they were in school, and they knew the difference between a hydraulic leak and an oil leak before they could multiply fractions. The 4010 was part of their childhood, the way the kitchen table was part of their childhood, a fixed point in the landscape of the place they lived, always present, always running, always available for the jobs that did not require power but required trust. Owen learned to drive on it at 9 years old, sitting in Eli's lap for the first 2 seasons before he was old enough and steady enough to take the seat himself. Nathan showed less interest in machinery and more interest in the way things worked on paper, in the rules and structures that governed transactions and agreements, which was a different kind of attention but not a lesser one. And Eli watched it develop in his second son with the same quiet regard he gave to everything that revealed itself gradually. Dean was the one who liked to talk, who asked questions that did not always have practical answers, and who would eventually find his way to a classroom in a town 12 miles south of Eldora, where he would spend his adult life teaching high school agriculture to students who mostly did not know yet that they needed to know it. Walter Cobb came to Eli's wedding. He sat in the 3rd row of the Lutheran church in Eldora, and he wore the same dark jacket he had worn to every formal occasion Eli had observed him attend, and he didn't make a toast or offer a speech. He shook Eli's hand outside the church afterward and told Clara that she had made a sound decision, which was the highest compliment Walter was capable of giving in a social setting. And Clara understood this immediately because she had grown up around men who expressed approval through understatement, and she thanked him in a way that made clear she had received the compliment in its full intended weight. By 1995, Eli was farming 380 acres across 6 separate rental arrangements and 1 small parcel he had purchased outright in 1992, using money he had been setting aside since the late 1980s with the specific intention of owning something that could not be taken back by a landlord's change of heart or a family decision made 3 counties away. He had 2 modern John Deere tractors by then, a 1989 4455 and a 1993 7700, both purchased used and both maintained with the same systematic attention he had learned from Walter. and the 4010 occupied its accustomed place in the corner of the main shed, still running, still used for the utility work, still the machine that Owen reached for when he needed something reliable for a job that did not demand horsepower. It was in October of 1997 that Garrett Weston gave an interview to a reporter from the Hardin County Index who was writing a feature about the recovery of the local agricultural economy following the farm crisis of the 1980s. The reporter had mentioned Eli Boone as an example of an operator who had started with almost nothing and built a substantial operation through the crisis years. And Garrett had responded with the particular care of someone who wants to be seen as fair-minded while advancing a specific position. He said that Eli Boone was a remarkable individual and that his story was genuinely inspiring. He said that the economics of starting a farm operation with a 20-year-old piece of used equipment were not something he would recommend to anyone serious about building a modern agricultural business, and that the lesson people should take from Eli's success was not that old machines were a viable foundation for a competitive operation, but that personal discipline and hard work could overcome almost any starting disadvantage if the individual was exceptional enough. He said that the exceptional cases should not be mistaken for a model. The article ran on a Thursday. By Friday morning, it had been read by most of the people in Hardin County who read the index, which was most of the people in Hardin County. Several younger farmers who had been considering asking Eli for advice decided, after reading Garrett's assessment, that the question was not worth asking. 2 of them bought new machines from the Iowa Falls dealership within the following 6 months. A third came to Eli anyway, in March of 1998, and sat at the kitchen table and asked what he actually thought. Eli told him. The man bought a used 1985 445 O for $11,000, rebuilt the transmission that winter, and was still farming it in 2015. He never mentioned the article. He never needed to. Eli read the article on Thursday evening at the kitchen table. Clara was across from him with a cup of coffee. He read it once through without comment, and then set it on the table and finished his coffee and went to the shop. He did not say anything about the article to Clara. He did not say anything about it to Walter. He did not say anything about it to anyone, which was not because it did not affect him, but because the response he was capable of giving to it was not verbal. The response was in the fields. It was in the ground condition and the yield records and the equipment that had been maintained correctly for 18 years and that was still doing the work it had been asked to do. The response was already written. It was just written in a language that Garrett Weston had spent his career choosing not to learn. Walter had his stroke in November of 1997, 3 weeks after the article ran. It was not fatal, but it was serious, in the way that strokes are serious for men in their late 70s, who have spent their lives in physical work and who have organized their identity around their ability to do that work without assistance. The weakness it left on his left side was enough to make operating equipment dangerous and enough to make the particular solitude of his farmhouse something that his daughter Patricia, who lived in Cedar Rapids and had not farmed a day in her adult life, could not in good conscience allow to continue. She came and arranged things with the practical efficiency of someone who loved her father, but who also understood that loving him meant making decisions he was not willing to make for himself. The equipment was sold at auction. The land was rented to a neighbor on a cash basis. Walter moved into an assisted living facility in Eldora that was clean and competently run and that Walter tolerated because he no longer had the physical reserves to argue against it. He had done something before the move, in the 2 weeks between the stroke and the transition, that no one knew about at the time. He had gone into the machine shed on a cold afternoon in late November, moving carefully along the wall with his good hand trailing the wood, and he had opened the tool compartment on the 4010 and placed inside it a metal box that he had sealed with a bead of weld along the seam. Inside the box was a leather-bound notebook, brown with age and filled with his handwriting from 1962 to the present. 35 years of observations about the ground and the water and the patterns that the instruments of modern agriculture could measure but could not interpret. And with the notebook was a single folded sheet of paper on which he had written, in the careful script he had used his whole life, a reference to a document filed in the Hardin County deed records in 1912 and a note in pencil beneath it that said, "The land drinks from the same source. Nobody owns the water. Nobody can." Before he closed the compartment, he ran his good hand along the engine cowling of the 4010 the way you touch something you are not certain you will see again. And then he closed it and walked back to the house. He said something to Eli the following week, in the living room of the farmhouse during one of Eli's visits. He said the machine holds something. When the time comes, you will know where to look. Eli assumed this was the kind of thing a man says in his late 70s, when the past has become more present than the future. He nodded and said he understood, and he did not think about it again with any particular urgency, because the time Walter had mentioned did not feel imminent in 1997, and because Eli's attention in those years was fully occupied by the living work of the farm and the 3 boys and the 380 acres that needed something from him every single day. He visited Walter every week from 1997 until the end. He brought the boys when they were old enough to sit still for an hour without requiring entertainment, and Walter talked to them about the farm and about the principles he had organized his working life around. Owen listened with the attention of someone who was already building the mental inventory he would spend his adult life drawing from. Nathan listened with the attention of someone who was trying to understand the structure beneath the story, the rules that made the outcome possible rather than accidental. Dean listened and asked questions that surprised Walter, questions about what the land had looked like before the drainage tiles were put in, about what his own father had thought about the ground when he first saw it. Questions that were less about agriculture than about time and continuity and the way one generation's decisions become the next generation's landscape. Walter answered all of them, but he answered Nathan's questions with a particular deliberateness, as though he understood that the boy who wanted to know the rules was the one who would eventually need to use them. Walter Cobb died in February of 2001. He was 83 years old. He had lived long enough to see Eli Boone become the kind of farmer that people in Hardin County pointed to when they wanted to explain what it meant to do the work with integrity across a long enough period of time that the integrity itself became visible in the land. The funeral was at the Lutheran Church on a Thursday, and the attendance was larger than Patricia had expected because Walter had been quiet enough in his later years that people had half forgotten how many of them carried something he had given them: a piece of advice, a fair rental agreement, a loan of equipment at a critical moment, a willingness to answer a question without making the person asking it feel inadequate for not already knowing the answer. These things had accumulated in the community the way Walter accumulated everything, without announcement and without the expectation that anyone would keep a record. Eli sat in the second row with Clara and the 3 boys. He did not speak at the service. After the burial in the churchyard on the north side of town, he drove back to the farm and went into the main shed and stood next to the 4010 in the February cold, his breath visible in the unheated air. And he stood there for a while without doing anything in particular. Then he checked the oil. The oil was fine. It was always fine. He had checked it 4 days ago and nothing had changed, and he knew nothing had changed. But he checked it anyway because it was the only language available to him for what he was feeling. And it was enough. The years after Walter's death were the years of expansion. Not dramatic expansion, not the kind of growth that requires borrowing against optimistic projections, but the steady kind that comes from reinvesting what the operation produces into the capacity to produce more of it. By 2005, Eli was farming 520 acres. By 2010, 640. By 2015, the number had reached just over 800, which in Hardin County was a substantial family operation, the kind that required real capital and real management, and that could support the people working it without requiring any of them to look for supplemental income somewhere else. Owen had come back after 2 years at Iowa State studying agronomy and had become Eli's full partner in the operation in 2010, the year Nathan graduated from the University of Iowa's law school and took a position with a mid-sized firm in Des Moines that handled agricultural and real estate law, which was not a coincidence, though Nathan had never quite articulated to himself why that particular specialty had attracted him above the others. Dean was teaching high school agriculture in Hampton, 12 miles south, and coaching the FFA chapter there with an enthusiasm that suggested he had found the work he was built for. Eli did not have opinions about what his sons chose to do with their lives, beyond what those choices revealed about their characters. What they revealed was that all 3 of them had the quality he had recognized in himself at 17, the willingness to give the work what it required without trying to negotiate the terms. This was enough. This was more than enough. The equipment had grown with the operation. There were 2 modern row crop tractors, a 2012 723 OR and a 2015 837 OR, both with GPS guidance systems and precision planting integration and cab technology that would have been incomprehensible to Walter Cobb. There was a 2014 combine that had cost more than the entire farm had been worth when Eli planted his first 40 acres. There were planters and tillage implements and grain handling systems that represented a different order of magnitude from the two-row planter and the estate sale combine of 1980. And in the corner of the main shed, exactly where it had always been, was the 1962 John Deere 4010, which was 56 years old in 2018, and which Eli kept running not because the operation required it, but because he was constitutionally incapable of allowing it to fall into disrepair. And because Owen had asked him once, at age 12, whether they would ever sell it, and Eli had said no in a tone that settled the question permanently. In April of 2018, a young man came to the farm. His name was Caleb Vance. He was 19 years old. He had come to Hardin County from a group home in Waterloo, where he had been living since aging out of the foster system 3 months earlier, having heard about harvest work in the area from another resident whose cousin had spent a season in Eldora. He had taken a bus to Iowa Falls and gotten a ride from a truck driver the rest of the way, and had walked into the co-op on the main street of Eldora and asked the man behind the counter if anyone in the area needed help. The man behind the counter had known Eli Boone for 30 years. He looked at Caleb Vance for a moment, taking in the duffel bag and the careful posture and the quality of attention in the boy's eyes, and he picked up the phone. Eli said to send him out. Caleb arrived at the farm on a Tuesday afternoon, and Eli met him in the driveway, and they walked the operation together for 2 hours. Eli showed him the equipment and the layout and the seasonal rhythm of the work. Caleb was quiet in the way of someone who had learned that observation was more useful than questions. He moved through the operation with a stillness that Eli recognized not from any particular memory but from something older than memory. A quality he had seen once before in himself at 17 and had not expected to see again so clearly in another person. He put Caleb on utility work first, running the grain cart, operating the loader, learning the implements in order of complexity, starting with the ones that were most forgiving of inexperience and working toward the ones that required the kind of feel that only accumulates through repetition. Within 3 weeks, Caleb had found a developing fault in the 7230R hydraulic circuit that Owen had checked twice and passed. He had found it not by looking, but by listening. Standing beside the machine at idle with his hand resting on the cowling, reading the vibration the way a man reads weather. Owen told Eli about it that evening. Eli said he knew. Owen asked what they were going to do about it. Eli said he was thinking about it. Clara, at the kitchen table with her coffee, said she thought Eli already knew what he was going to do and was just taking his time arriving at it. Eli did not disagree. It was in August of that year that Preston Hale came to the farm for the first time. He drove a black G-Wagon that was visibly wrong for the gravel roads of Hardin County, the kind of vehicle that announces its driver's relationship to the landscape before the driver has said a word. He was 38 years old, and he wore the kind of clothes that indicated he had made peace with the fact that he would never be taken for someone who worked with his hands. And he had the practiced directness of someone who had learned that the most effective way to close a transaction was to make the other party feel that the terms were already settled and that resistance was a form of denial rather than a legitimate position. He was a senior acquisitions director for Aldercroft Land Group, a real estate development company based in Des Moines that had been quietly purchasing agricultural land in several Iowa counties over the preceding 18 months. Eli had heard about the purchases. 6 operations in the area surrounding his had changed hands in the past year, all of them to buyers who had not identified themselves publicly. All of them at prices that were 15 to 20% above what the ground would have brought at a conventional agricultural valuation. The pattern was visible to anyone who was paying attention. Eli had been paying attention. Preston Hale sat at Eli's kitchen table and explained what Aldercroft was planning, which was a mixed-use industrial and light commercial development on approximately 3,000 acres in the corridor where Hardin County's agricultural land adjoined the county road infrastructure. He explained it with the fluency of someone who had given the same presentation many times and who believed in what he was describing, not merely as a profitable transaction, but as a genuine improvement of the region's economic prospects. He was not, Eli thought, a dishonest man. He was a man who had organized his understanding of value around a set of assumptions that did not include the particular value of ground that had been farmed correctly for 4 generations. He put the offer on the table without preamble. $2,800,000 for 812 acres, which was 40% above the current agricultural appraisal. He put a cashier's check on the table beside the offer document as a good faith deposit, sufficient to demonstrate that Aldercroft's interest was real and its capital was available. He said, "You are not a young man anymore. Your sons have their own lives. This is a number that changes what is possible for your family." Eli looked at the check for a moment. Then he picked it up and held it out across the table and said he was not interested. Hale took the check back without visible frustration, which told Eli that the refusal had been anticipated and that this visit was the opening position in a longer engagement rather than the final one. He said he understood that the decision deserved careful consideration and that Aldercroft would be in touch. He drove back down this gravel road, and Eli watched the dust settle after him, and then went back into the shop where Caleb was servicing the grain cart bearing he had identified as worn the previous week. What Eli did not know in August of 2018 was that Garrett Weston had been retained by Aldercroft 6 months earlier as an agricultural consultant, his role being to provide expert analysis of the farming operations in the target area and to advise the company on the use of the land's agricultural value in its negotiations with current owners. Garrett was 64 years old, and he had sold the dealership in Iowa Falls 3 years earlier to a regional chain and was now doing consulting work for various agricultural and development interests in the county. The arrangement with Aldercroft paid him well and gave him work that felt important and that he had, over the months of the engagement, come to believe in genuinely. The way people come to believe in the things they are paid to believe in when the payment is sufficient, and the belief is not too far from something they were already inclined toward. He had reviewed the Boone operation as part of his assessment of the target area and had characterized it in his report as a well-managed traditional operation with yields that reflected solid agronomic practice, but that were not exceptional by the standards of the larger consolidated operations that had replaced the family farm model in most of the surrounding counties. He had not said anything false. He had simply described what was true without describing what it meant, which is a different kind of dishonesty, the kind that is harder to argue against in a legal proceeding. Aldercroft filed its petition in March of 2022. The petition invoked the public necessity doctrine, a legal mechanism that allows a governmental or quasi-governmental body to compel the sale of private property for a public benefit purpose under specific conditions. Aldercroft's attorneys had structured the development project in a way that qualified, on paper, for this designation by partnering with a county economic development authority that stood to benefit from the tax revenue the development would generate. It was not a straightforward application of the doctrine, but it was not frivolous either, and the legal argument was supported by a stack of documentation that represented a significant investment in preparation. Garrett Weston was named as the company's expert witness on agricultural land use and value. His report characterized the Boone operation and the surrounding farmland as having reached what he called a productivity plateau, a state in which continued agricultural use would generate diminishing economic returns relative to the land's potential value under alternative development. He cited current yield data, commodity price projections, and land use efficiency metrics from the Regional Agricultural Extension Office. He concluded that the public economic benefit of the proposed development substantially exceeded the economic benefit of continued agricultural use. The report did not mention the Aquifer Covenant of 1912. It was not clear whether Garrett knew about it. What was clear, from the way the petition was structured, was that Aldercroft's attorneys had argued that any deed restrictions or covenants attached to the target parcels had lapsed under the Iowa statute that applied a 75-year limitation to the enforceability of certain restrictive covenants. This argument was present in the petition as a subordinate clause, 3 sentences in a 40-page document, which was either oversight or strategy, and in Eli's experience, these two things were often the same. Nathan Boone had been practicing agricultural and real estate law in Des Moines for 12 years, when his father called him in March of 2022 and described the petition. Nathan listened without interrupting, which was a professional habit, and then asked 3 questions: how many parcels were named in the petition, whether Eli had received any written communication from Aldercroft since the August 2018 visit, and whether the operation carried any debt against the named parcels. Eli answered all 3. Nathan said he would be there on Saturday. He reviewed the petition and the supporting documentation over a weekend at the kitchen table where Preston Hale had placed the cashier's check 4 years earlier, and he identified the covenant argument in the subordinate clause and sat with it for a long time. He knew something about covenant law in Iowa. enough to know that Aldercroft's 75-year lapse argument was legally contestable but not obviously wrong, and that contesting it would require evidence that the covenant had been actively maintained and was not merely an artifact of a transaction too old to be practically relevant. And he told his father what he was looking for. He said if there is anything in the deed records that speaks to the covenant's status after 1937, anything that was filed or acknowledged or referenced in a subsequent transaction, it would substantially change the legal position. Eli listened to this and did not say anything for a long time. He was thinking about something Walter had said in 1997. The machine holds something. When the time comes, you will know where to look. He said nothing to Nathan about this. He said he would look into the records question and Nathan should move forward with the legal response in the meantime. The hearing was scheduled for June of 2022. Owen was in the shop with Caleb the following week when Eli came in on a Tuesday afternoon and told Caleb he wanted him to do a full inspection of the 401, not a service inspection but a structural one. Every compartment, every access panel, every storage space, everything. He said he wanted to know the condition of every part of that machine that was not routinely inspected. He said this without explaining why, because the explanation was not something he was ready to say out loud. Caleb spent 3 days on the inspection. He worked methodically, starting at the front and working back, opening every access point and documenting what he found. On the third day, in the afternoon, he found the tool compartment at the rear of the operator's platform that had been welded shut along the seam with a bead that was not factory work and that had been there long enough that the weld had oxidized to match the surrounding metal. He came to Eli in the house and said there is something in the compartment behind the seat. It has been welded closed, and Eli went to the shop with him and looked at the weld and then got the angle grinder and cut along the seam himself, slowly and carefully, the way you open something that has been waiting for a long time and that you want to treat with the respect due to things that have been kept. When the compartment came open, there was a metal box inside, its surface dark with age but intact. And when Eli lifted it out and felt its weight, he understood immediately that it was not empty and that whatever was inside had been placed there with intention, and he carried it to the workbench and set it down. Caleb stood nearby. Owen had come in from the other bay and was standing in the doorway. Eli opened the box with a flat screwdriver along the lip, and inside was a leather notebook, brown and worn, and beneath the notebook, folded carefully, a single sheet of paper. He opened the notebook first. It was Walter's handwriting, in the precise script he had used his whole life, beginning in March of 1962 with the first season's observations on the ground conditions of the home farm. Eli turned the pages slowly, 35 years of entries, water table measurements taken at the same locations each spring, flood cycle records going back to the 1930s as Walter had reconstructed them from his father's notes, soil composition observations from specific fields, and threaded through all of it, a pattern of underground water movement across the parcels that now included Eli's 800 acres and the 6 parcels Aldercroft had purchased. A pattern that the notebook documented with the specificity of someone who had understood for a long time that the water beneath the land was the land's most essential fact and that this fact was not visible on any map that anyone was currently consulting. Eli set the notebook down and unfolded the sheet of paper. It was dated 1989. It was a letter from an attorney in Iowa Falls addressed to Walter Cobb, confirming a legal opinion rendered following Walter's inquiry about the enforceability of a water rights covenant filed in the Hardin County deed records in 1912. The letter stated, in plain language, that the covenant in question was a class of water rights agreement that under Iowa law was not subject to the standard 75-year lapse provision because it pertained to shared aquifer access across multiple parcels and had been explicitly designated as running with the land in perpetuity at the time of filing. The letter stated that the covenant remained fully enforceable as of the date of the opinion and would remain so indefinitely absent a voluntary agreement among all affected parties to modify or extinguish it. At the bottom of the letter, in Walter's pencil, a single line, Filed Deed Book 14, page 211. Do not let them tell you it has expired. It has not. Eli stood at the workbench with the letter in his hand for a long time. The shop was quiet. Owen had stopped moving in the doorway. Caleb was standing exactly still at the edge of the light. Eli folded the letter back along its original creases and set it next to the notebook. He thought about Walter Cobb in the machine shed in November of 1997, moving along the wall with his good hand trailing the wood, placing this box in this compartment, welding it shut, walking back to the house. He thought about the 4 years Walter had lived after that before he died, 4 years during which he could have given Eli the box directly, could have explained it, could have made certain it was not lost. He had not done any of those things. He had said the machine holds something. When the time comes, you will know where to look. Eli had not looked until the time came. That was not an accident. That was exactly what Walter had intended. He picked up the phone and called Nathan. Nathan arrived on a Friday evening, driving 4 hours from Des Moines without stopping, and he sat at the kitchen table with the notebook and the letter spread in front of him and read both documents twice through without speaking. Clara brought coffee and set it beside him and went back to the other room, understanding as she always had the difference between moments that required her presence and moments that required her absence. Owen sat across from Nathan. Caleb had gone back to the equipment shed, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he understood instinctively that the conversation about to happen belonged to the family, and that his place in the story was not yet fully defined, and that this was not a diminishment but simply the truth of where he stood. Nathan read the attorney's letter a third time. Then he set it down and looked at his father. He said, "Do you understand what this is?" Eli said he had a general idea. Nathan said this letter establishes that the covenant was professionally evaluated in 1989 and found to be fully enforceable. That opinion predates Aldercroft's purchases by nearly 30 years. It means their title searches should have found this. It means their attorneys either found it and built the lapse argument knowing it was contestable, or they did not find it and their due diligence was inadequate. Either way, the covenant stands. And if the covenant stands, their entire public necessity argument collapses. Owen said, "Why does the covenant collapse their argument?" Nathan said, "Because the public necessity doctrine requires a showing that the proposed use is compatible with existing encumbrances on the land. The Aquifer Covenant creates a shared water use obligation across all 14 parcels in the original 1912 agreement. If Aldercroft builds an industrial development on the parcels they already own, they trigger the covenant and become liable to every other parcel holder for interference with shared aquifer access. That liability would cost them more than the development is worth. Their entire project depends on this covenant not existing or not being enforceable." The silence that followed was the kind that accumulates when several people are simultaneously understanding the dimensions of something for the first time. Eli said Walter knew this in 1989. Nathan said Walter knew this, and he kept the proof in a place where it would survive and where the right person would find it when the right moment arrived. Eli reached across the table and picked up the attorney's letter and looked at the date again. 1989, the same year Walter had come back from Iowa Falls with the knowledge that what was beneath the land was protected in a way that the land itself was not, and had filed that knowledge in the only archive he trusted completely, which was the machine that had been running for 27 years at that point, and that he intended to keep running for as long as there was someone willing to do what was necessary. The hearing was set for the second week of June in the Hardin County Courthouse in Eldora, a building that had been standing since 1892 and that had the particular gravity of structures that have absorbed a great deal of human consequence over a long period of time. Nathan filed the covenant documentation with the court 2 weeks before the hearing, attaching the original deed book reference, the 1989 legal opinion, and Walter's notebook as a supporting exhibit, documenting the continuous and material relevance of the aquifer in question to the agricultural operations of the named parcels. Aldercroft's legal team responded within 4 days. Their response characterized the notebook as a personal document of uncertain evidentiary value and argued that the 1989 legal opinion was a private communication that did not constitute a judicial or administrative determination of the covenant's enforceability. They maintained their position that the 75-year lapse provision applied. The response was competent and the argument was not frivolous. But Nathan had read enough Iowa water rights case law in the 3 weeks since his father called him to know that the lapse provision argument had been tested and rejected in 2 previous cases involving shared aquifer covenants, and that those cases were precisely on point. He did not communicate this to Aldercroft's attorneys. He filed a brief that cited both cases and let the court read it. Preston Hale came back to the farm in May, 10 days before the hearing. He came alone this time, without the G-Wagon. in a rental sedan that was slightly less conspicuous on the gravel road, and he sat at the kitchen table for the second time and spoke with the directness of someone who has revised his understanding of a situation and is making one final attempt to resolve it before it moves into a domain where he no longer controls the outcome. He said that Aldercroft was prepared to increase their offer to $3,400,000 and to include a provision that would allow Eli to remain on the property as a tenant operator for up to 7 years, with Aldercroft covering all operating costs during that period. He said this reflected their genuine respect for what Eli had built over 4 decades. He said that litigation was unpredictable and that the costs of a contested hearing would fall on both parties regardless of the outcome. Eli listened to the entire offer. Then he said, "You knew about the covenant." Hale was quiet for a moment. He said, "Our legal team identified it as likely unenforceable under current statute." Eli said, "Garrett Weston told you it was unenforceable." Hale said he was not in a position to discuss the details of the company's legal strategy. Eli said he understood that. He said he was not interested in the offer. He said he had not been interested in August of 2018, and he was not interested now, and that this was not a negotiating position but a factual statement about his intentions. He said it without anger and without particular emphasis, in the same tone he used to tell Owen that a field was ready to plant or a bearing was getting close to replacement. The tone of someone communicating an accurate assessment of conditions. Hale picked up the offer document and put it back in his briefcase. He stood and extended his hand, and Eli shook it, because Eli did not have the habit of refusing a handshake regardless of the circumstances. And Hale walked back to the rental sedan and drove down the gravel road for the last time. The morning of the hearing was clear and cool for June, the kind of morning that Hardin County produced occasionally in early summer when the humidity had not yet built to its midsummer weight, and the light came in at an angle that made the fields look like something from before the era of commercial agriculture. Rich and uncomplicated and permanent. Eli drove to the courthouse in his truck, Owen beside him, Nathan following in his own car. Caleb had offered to come, and Eli had told him he was needed at the farm, which was true in a practical sense, but was also Eli's way of keeping the day organized around the people whose roles in it were clear. The courtroom was not large. It had the wooden benches and the high windows and the particular smell of old institutional buildings that have been used for serious purposes over many decades. There were perhaps 30 people present when the hearing began, a mix of county officials, Aldercroft representatives, local landowners who had an interest in the outcome, and 2 reporters from regional agricultural publications who had been covering the Aldercroft acquisitions for several months. Garrett Weston was seated at the plaintiff's table with Aldercroft's legal team. He was 68 years old, and he wore a jacket and tie, and he had the manner of someone who had been in this kind of proceeding before and who believed his testimony was on solid ground. He did not look at Eli when Eli came in, which Eli noted without particular feeling. Aldercroft's lead attorney was a woman named Colleen Fraser, who practiced from a large firm in Des Moines, and who had a reputation for thorough preparation and for the kind of calm that comes from having won enough difficult cases to trust the preparation. She opened with a clear and organized presentation of the public necessity argument, laying out the economic development projections and the county partnership structure and the land use analysis in a sequence designed to establish the legitimacy of the petition before addressing the covenant question. She arrived at the covenant question after 40 minutes. She characterized it as a legacy document from an era of agricultural land use that had been superseded by more than a century of subsequent transactions and development patterns. She argued that the 1989 legal opinion was a private communication rather than a binding determination. She argued that the 75-year lapse provision had been consistently applied in Iowa to covenants of the same general class and that the court should apply it here. Then Garrett Weston was called to testify. He testified for 25 minutes about the agricultural economics of the target area, about yield trends and commodity price projections, and the long-term viability of family-scale operations in the current market environment. He was precise and well-prepared, and the testimony was consistent with his written report. He characterized the Boone operation as a well-managed traditional farm that represented the end of a generational model rather than the beginning of a sustainable one. Nathan cross-examined him for 11 minutes. The first 8 minutes were about the covenant. Nathan established, through a series of questions that Garrett answered carefully, but that progressively narrowed his available responses, that Garrett had been retained by Aldercroft 6 months before the petition was filed, that his review of the target parcels had included an examination of the deed records, and that the deed book reference to the 1912 covenant was present in those records and would have been visible to any competent review. Then Nathan asked, "Did you identify the aquifer covenant of 1912 in the course of your review?" Garrett said, "I identified a document that referenced an early covenant. My assessment was that it had lapsed under the applicable statute." Nathan said, "Are you a licensed attorney in the state of Iowa?" Garrett said, "No." Nathan said, "So when you offered an assessment of the covenant's enforceability, you were offering an opinion outside your area of professional qualification." Garrett said, "I was offering a professional judgment based on my experience in agricultural land transactions." Nathan said, "Did you disclose to Aldercroft that the covenant had been the subject of a legal opinion in 1989 that found it to be fully enforceable and not subject to the lapse provision?" There was a pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in a courtroom is a long time. Garrett said, "I was not aware of that opinion at the time of my review." Nathan said the opinion was filed with a reference notation in the same deed book where the covenant appears, a notation made by the property owner at the time. "Did your review of Deed Book 14 include the pages following the covenant entry?" Another pause. Garrett said, "My review was focused on the covenant document itself." Nathan said, "So your review was selective rather than comprehensive?" Garrett did not answer immediately. His attorney objected on the grounds that the question characterized the witness's professional conduct. The judge sustained the objection on form and asked Nathan to rephrase. Nathan rephrased. Garrett answered that his review had been focused on the documents directly relevant to Aldercroft's legal question. Nathan said, "And you concluded, without legal qualification and without reviewing all available documentation in the deed book, that the covenant was unenforceable, and you provided that conclusion to Aldercroft as the basis for their acquisition strategy." Fraser objected again. The judge looked at her for a moment and then looked at Garrett and said he would allow the question. Garrett said he had provided his professional assessment based on the information available to him. Nathan said a document on the exhibit table. He said, "I am introducing as Exhibit F the legal opinion dated March 14, 1989, prepared by attorney Lawrence Whitfield of Iowa Falls, addressed to Walter Cobb of Hardin County, Iowa, concerning the enforceability of the Aquifer Covenant filed in Deed Book 14, page 211. The opinion states in its conclusion that the covenant is a perpetual water rights encumbrance that is not subject to the standard lapse provision under Iowa Code, section 614.17, because it pertains to shared aquifer access designated as running with the land in perpetuity at the time of original filing. I am also introducing as Exhibit G the notation made in Walter Cobb's hand in the same deed book, cross-referencing this opinion, which notation is dated 1989 and which was present in the publicly accessible county deed records at the time Aldercroft's review was conducted." He looked at Garrett Weston and said, "You missed this." It was not a question. Garrett did not answer it. The judge called a 30-minute recess. During the recess, Eli sat on a bench in the hallway outside the courtroom with Owen beside him and watched the Aldercroft legal team move in and out of a conference room at the end of the corridor with the focused energy of people who are revising their understanding of their position. Fraser came out twice and made calls on her phone. Preston Hale, who had been seated in the gallery and who had not looked at Eli during the morning's proceedings, was not visible in the hallway. Owen said, "What happens now?" Eli said, "Nathan will tell us when the recess is over." Owen said, "Do you think they will drop it?" Eli said he did not know. He said it did not matter what they did in the next 30 minutes. It mattered what the covenant said and what the law said, and both of those things had been established. The rest was process. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said Walter figured this out in 1989. He figured out that someone would come for the land eventually, and he made sure the proof would survive him. Eli said he figured it out and he put it where it would be safe. Owen said in the machine. Eli said in the machine. They sat with that for a moment in the hallway of the Hardin County Courthouse, the morning light coming through the tall windows at the end of the corridor. And Eli thought about what it meant to prepare for a threat you could not fully see yet, against a timeline you could not predict, using the only materials you completely trusted. He thought about the notebook and the letter and the pencil notation in the deed book. All of it, accumulated and preserved with the same methodical faithfulness that Walter had applied to every other aspect of his working life. He had not been protecting a legal document. He had been protecting a truth. The document was just the form the truth took when it needed to be understood by people who required things in writing. When the hearing resumed, Fraser presented a modified argument. She did not abandon the petition, but she withdrew the covenant lapse argument and offered instead a proposal for a negotiated easement arrangement that would allow the development to proceed without triggering the covenant's shared aquifer provisions. The proposal was complex and would require the agreement of all 14 parcel holders in the original covenant, which was a condition she described as achievable through good faith negotiation with each affected landowner. The judge listened and then asked Nathan for a response. Nathan said that the modified proposal was a substantial retreat from the original petition, and that it demonstrated that the public necessity argument as originally structured was no longer being advanced. He said that without the public necessity finding, Aldercroft had no mechanism to compel any landowner's participation, and that the petition should be dismissed on those grounds. The judge agreed. He dismissed the petition with a written ruling filed 3 weeks later that included a finding that the covenant was enforceable as a perpetual water rights encumbrance, and that any development strategy in the affected area would need to account for that encumbrance at the outset, rather than as an afterthought. The ruling also noted, in a paragraph that Nathan read twice in his car in the courthouse parking lot before driving back to the farm, that the expert testimony provided by the plaintiff's agricultural consultant had been based on an incomplete review of the relevant deed records, and that the court found his conclusions regarding the covenant's status to be unsupported by the available documentation. This finding was not a legal sanction, it was a judicial observation. But judicial observations of that kind have consequences in professional contexts, and the consequences for Garrett Weston's consulting work would make themselves apparent in the months that followed. And Aldercroft liquidated its 6 Hardin County parcels over the following 8 months, selling them to a combination of neighboring farm operations and a land trust, at prices that reflected the covenant's encumbrance and that amounted to a loss of approximately $4,200,000 against what the company had paid for them. Preston Hale had been reassigned to a different regional market before the liquidation was complete. The Hardin County development project was never publicly announced, and therefore could not be publicly abandoned, which was the kind of outcome that allowed everyone involved to avoid the specific vocabulary of failure. Garrett Weston retired from consulting the following spring. He sold the house he had owned in Iowa Falls for 31 years and moved to a smaller place in Ames where his daughter lived. He did not give interviews about the Aldercroft project. He had spent 45 years in the implement and consulting business in Hardin County, and he had built a reputation that was, by most measures, an honest one. And the Aldercroft project had cost him a significant portion of it in ways that were not entirely his fault and were not entirely not his fault. And he carried that cost in the way of someone who knows the difference between a mistake and a choice and is not entirely certain which category applies. Eli heard about the retirement from Owen, who had heard it from someone at the co-op. He received the information the way he received most things that had already run their course, which was without visible reaction. He set down his coffee and went back to the shop. There was a cover crop to get in before the ground froze, and the East Field would not wait for anyone's retirement. In the fall of 2022, with the legal matter resolved and the operation continuing in the way it had always continued, Eli stood in the main shed one October evening and looked at the 3 tractors that occupied the far bay. The 4010, the 1958 Farmall 560 he had bought at an estate sale in 2003 and restored over 2 winters, and the 1971 John Deere 4020 acquired from a retiring farmer in Bremer County in 2009 and maintained since then as a working machine rather than a showpiece. 3 machines, each of them older than most of the people who operated equipment in the county now. Each of them running with the reliability that results from maintenance conducted as a discipline rather than a response to failure. He had been thinking about Caleb Vance for most of that fall, not in any way that required resolution, but in the way that important decisions present themselves before they announce themselves, as a persistent awareness at the edge of attention that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Caleb had been with the operation for 4 years. He had expanded from the 40 acres Eli had offered him in 2019 to 80 acres. 2021 had paid off his first operating loan ahead of schedule, and had rebuilt a 6-row planter from the 1990s over the previous winter with a thoroughness that the Iowa Falls dealer had mentioned to Owen at a parts counter conversation, saying that the work was better than what most people did with new equipment. He was 23 years old. He was the same age Eli had been when Eli was farming 160 acres with 2 employees and a down payment on a house. And the parallel was not subtle if you were paying attention. And Eli had always been paying attention. On the last day of the harvest season in October of 2022, Eli told Caleb to come to the shop after they finished cleaning the combine. He told Owen first, that evening at supper, what he intended to do. Owen listened and then said all 3 of them. Eli said yes. Owen was quiet for a moment and then said he thought that was right. Clara, across the table, said nothing, because she had known since the spring that this was coming, and she had already arrived at the same place Eli had arrived, which was that the story was not theirs to keep. When Caleb came to the shop, the 3 tractors were in the main bay, aligned in order, the 4010 at the near end where the light was best. Eli stood beside them and Caleb stood in the doorway, and Owen was at the far end of the bay with his back half turned, the way a man stands when he wants to be present without being seen to witness. Eli said, "I want to tell you something about these 3 machines." Caleb said he was listening. Eli said the 4010 was given to him in September of 1979 by a man named Walter Cobb, who had farmed Hardin County for 38 years and who gave it to him because he thought Eli was going to need it. He said he had $11 at the time and a duffel bag and a job washing dishes, and no reason that anyone looking at the situation from the outside would have recognized to believe that the gift was anything other than an eccentric old man's impulsive gesture. He said he had farmed his first 40 acres with it and had kept it running for 43 years because he was not constitutionally capable of not keeping it running, and because the machine had taught him things about patience and attention and the relationship between care and reliability that he had not been able to learn any other way. He said the other 2 he had bought and restored himself because he had learned from Walter that machines maintained correctly across long periods of time held a different kind of value than their market price reflected. And because he had known for a long time that he wanted to have something to give. Caleb said, "Give to who?" Eli said, "To someone who is going to need it." He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas jacket and took out 3 folded documents and held them out. Caleb took them. They were the titles to the 3 tractors. Eli said the 4010 you need to understand first, because it will teach you patience in the literal mechanical sense, the kind that cannot be faked and cannot be shortcut. The 560 will teach you about power and how to use it without waste. The 4020 will show you the balance between the 2. You will understand what I mean after you have been running them for a while. Caleb stood holding the 3 titles the way Eli had stood in a gravel driveway in September of 1979, holding one. And he said the same thing Eli had said to Walter, which was why. And Eli said the same thing Walter had said to him, which was because you are going to need them. And Caleb said he could not pay for them, and Eli said he knew that. And Caleb said he did not understand, and Eli said he would. Owen did not move for a long moment. Then he set down the wrench he had been holding without purpose and walked out of the shed into the October dark. The season that followed was the kind that tests new farmers in ways the experienced ones have already learned to navigate. Caleb planted his second expanded acreage in the spring of 2023, and he did it the way Eli had planted in 1980, waiting for the ground rather than the calendar, reading the soil condition instead of the date. By harvest, the 3 tractors had settled into the rhythms of his operation the way good tools settle into a working life, not as objects but as relationships. And in September of that year, a boy named Jesse Mercer came to the farm. He was Dot Mercer's grandson. Dot had been gone 11 years, but her daughter Patricia had kept the diner's stories alive the way her mother had kept everything, which was carefully and without sentiment. Jesse had grown up knowing Eli Boone's name the way some children grow up knowing the names of rivers, as part of the permanent geography of the place they live. He had not come to Caleb by accident. Nothing in this county moved by accident when the right people were paying attention. He was 16 years old, quick and observant, and he had the kind of hands that physical work develops early in people who are given it young enough. His interest in machinery expressed itself not as enthusiasm, but as a particular quality of focus when something mechanical was operating in front of him. The kind of focus that is less about the machine and more about the conversation the machine is having with the person running it. Caleb put him on the 4010 first. Not because it was the most efficient machine for the work at hand, because it was the one that taught patience. And because Caleb had learned from Eli and Eli had learned from Walter that patience was the first discipline and the foundation of everything that followed. and that the machines designed to correct your mistakes before you noticed them were useful, but were not teachers in the way that the 4010 was a teacher. Because teaching required letting the student feel the consequences of their errors rather than smoothing over them. Jesse struggled with it in the first week. The hydraulic response was slower than what he had experienced on the modern equipment he had run briefly during a previous harvest season, and his instinct was to compensate by forcing the inputs, which the 4010 responded to by performing exactly as badly as the inputs deserved, with no electronic mediation and no automatic correction, just the direct mechanical expression of what the operator had asked of it. Caleb stood beside him during the second afternoon and watched without intervening for 20 minutes. Then he said, "It is not fighting you. It is showing you what you are doing." Jesse said, "What do you mean?" Caleb said, "Every time it does not respond the way you expect, that is information about what you asked it. The machine is accurate. You are not yet. Pay attention to what it is telling you and stop trying to tell it what to do." Jesse looked at him and said, "How do you know this?" Caleb said, "Someone showed me." He did not say who. He did not need to. Jesse turned back to the tractor and tried again. And this time he tried with less force and more attention. And the response was different. Not perfect, but different, measurably closer to what he had intended. And the difference was the beginning of something that would take years to fully develop, but that had now been started. And starting it correctly was the thing that mattered most. Eli Boone in the fall of 2023 was 61 years old, which was exactly the age Walter Cobb had been in September of 1979 when he had handed a title to a boy in a gravel driveway and said 4 words that had traveled now through 3 pairs of hands across 4 decades of Hardin County ground. He had not planned this symmetry. It had arrived on its own, the way the meaningful symmetries in a life usually do, without announcement, visible only when you stop and look at the shape of things from a sufficient distance. Clara had pointed it out to him one evening in September while they sat on the porch after supper. She said, "You are the same age Walter was." Eli said, "I know." She said, "What do you think about that?" He sat with the question for a while. The fields were doing what fields do in late September, absorbing the light and holding it for a moment before releasing it back into the cooling air. And Eli watched this happen the way Walter had watched it happen for 61 years before him, without trying to describe it or contain it, just receiving it as the information it was. He said, "I think Walter knew what he was doing." Clara said, "I think so too." They sat on the porch until the light was gone. On an afternoon in early October, Eli drove out to the east field where Caleb had Jesse running the 4010 on a light tillage pass ahead of the cover crop seeding. He parked his truck on the headland and sat with the window down and watched the machine work the ground. Jesse had found the rhythm of it by then, not the full understanding. That would take seasons, but the beginning of the accommodation that happens when a person stops fighting a machine and starts listening to it. The threshold moment where instruction becomes experience. The 4010 moved across the field with the particular deliberateness of a machine that has been doing this work for 61 years, carrying in its iron and its hydraulic fluid and the specific wear pattern of its steering wheel, the accumulated intentions of every person who had operated it, and doing the work with a kind of authority that newer machines, for all their precision and capability, had not yet had time to develop. It was not fast. It was not efficient by the measures that current agricultural economics applied to field operations. It was something that efficiency metrics did not have a category for, which was faithful. And faithfulness over a long enough period of time had a value that did not appear in the yield data, but that showed up in everything else. Caleb was standing at the edge of the field watching Jesse work. Eli sat in his truck and watched Caleb watch Jesse, and he thought about Walter watching him from the window of a farmhouse in the fall of 1985, saying nothing. Just watching. Just confirming for himself that the thing he had seen in a boy washing dishes through a pass-through window had been real and had been worth the title to a machine that a dealer in Iowa Falls had offered $3,200 for, and that Walter had said no to without explanation, because the explanation was not something that translated into the language of price. He did not get out of the truck. He watched for a while, and then he started the engine and drove back to the farm. Jesse Mercer was 16 years old and learning patience on a 61-year-old tractor in a field east of Eldora, Iowa. He didn't know yet what the machine was teaching him. He would not know for years. But the teaching was happening regardless of whether he understood it, because that was the nature of the kind of instruction that is built into iron and hydraulic fluid and the weight of a steering wheel worn smooth by decades of working hands. The kind that does not require the student to be ready, only to be present and willing to stop fighting what they do not yet understand. Somewhere in that fact, if you sat with it long enough, was everything Walter Cobb had understood about what the ground asks of you and what you owe the next person who needs to learn it. One man gave a tractor to a boy with nothing in September of 1979. That boy farmed with it for 43 years and gave it and 2 more to another boy with nothing in October of 2022. That boy is farming with them now and teaching a 3rd boy what the iron already knows. And the chain that began in a gravel driveway with 4 words has not broken and shows no sign of breaking, as long as there is someone in each generation willing to say those words to someone who needs to hear them, and to mean them in the full and costly way that Walter Cobb meant them, which was without condition, without contract, and without any form of accounting, grounded only in the belief that the person standing in front of you was worth more than the thing you were handing them, and that the thing you were really handing them was the proof of that belief. Because you were going to need it.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm journey.